weeks ago, my class was asked by a teacher, "What is morality?" I was taken aback, and we, having not deeply considered this question before, replied, "Personal principles deciding the difference between right and wrong?" The response we got was a slow nod and pensive look. Presentism is the practice of applying modern-day morality to the past. And that phrase, modern-day morality, is where I'd like to begin my talk tonight. Although most dictionaries would agree with my broad definition of morality, obtaining a consensus for the whole world's idea of such proves much thornier. For some, euthanasia is an act of murder. For others, it is an act of kindness. Is doing right, signing endless online petitions, sweating your way to a finish line for charity, or cultivating a marvelous mustache in Movember to raise awareness? Are we now only morally just when our actions will benefit others? A tricky question to which I'm sure we'd all have varied answers to. It is unlikely that any consensus of what the modern-day population thinks of as being morally correct or incorrect will be unanimous, as our thoughts are fickle and a change is part of who we are. Our morals have never quite been set in stone. They have shape-shifted since their beginning, through time and across the world. They have become the Play-Doh of the people, and societies since have consistently been molding their hand into principles that benefit their wants, needs, and way of life most. Thus, difference is to be expected across the globe. Morality can undergo a revolution within a generation. It was not until 1928 when women first achieved the same voting rights as men. In Germany, it was 1918, Switzerland, 1971, and United Arab Emirates, 2006. In the centuries prior to this, many thought that women having this right was wrong. I'm sure some still do. And this problem of inconsistency is especially prevalent in today's society, with our widespread access to information via the internet. Not all of us are no longer constrained by herd mentality, ignorance. And we're more likely to form our own code of ethics. Therefore, what is morally just in our day and age is entirely subjective and cannot be concretely defined. This is one of the most compelling criticisms of presentism. Can one condemn restricting women's right to vote, since, given that morals are subjective and fluid, who is to say that a single person's morals are right or wrong? For one to deem something as incorrect does not necessarily prove that it is fundamentally wrong. Secondly, there is no way to prove that one person's code of morals are truly aligned with modern-day morality, by which presentism aims to judge the past. Presentism is believed by some, such as historian David Fisher, to be a common fallacy in historical writing, the fallacy of nunc pro tunc, now for then, applying judgment to an earlier date. It is generally agreed that discussions of the past should be unclouded by bias, and thus approaches such as presentism should not be employed. Another key argument against presentism exists. It doesn't matter. What does the discussion or judgment of the past actually achieve? The past is the past, and we can do nothing about it now. Similarly, debating on what historical figures were like is no different than debating about fictional characters. In our day and age, they only exist in stories. I believe a case for presentism exists. After all, we have been using the practice in various ways for a long time. In the 19th century, students were expected to study ancient history to find therein exemplars of politics in the present. Our political system was inspired by the ancient Greeks. To take notes from the past with the purpose of applying it to the future, therein must lie a judgment. In this case, we deemed the Greeks' example to be a positive influence. My case for presentism can be broken down to two key points. Judging the past leads to apologies, and those are needed. Second, we learn from it and can do better. Let us start with apologies. It was in 2009 that World War II codebreaker Alan Turing was offered an apology by Prime Minister Gordon Brown. He was arrested in 1952, and his crime? Being homosexual. It was not until 50 years ago that the Sexual Offences Act made it legal for two men to be together, as long as it was in private and they were over 21 years of age. Turing was sentenced to chemical castration by a series of injections of female hormones, but he killed himself before this could take full effect. Why was this apology important? Apologies are definitely not conclusions, but they are beginnings. Not only was it a step in the right direction towards equality, but for the surviving nieces and nephews of Turing, for the surviving relatives of any gay person who is unjustly punished for their sexuality, there is a sense of peace. A recognition of wrongdoing by our government gives cause for optimism that such won't happen again in the future. And this isn't a perfect world. Hate crime still exists, but at least there's hope. Upon saying Kniefall von Warschau, some will remember Willy Brandt's historic act in 1970, a silent demonstration of empathy and understanding for the victims of the Warsaw Ghetto uprising. He laid a wreath next to a commemorative monument and then knelt before it to what is reported as everyone's surprise. This was one of the first times that Germany showed remorse for the war. Not only did Brandt remind Germany that Nazism is something to be remembered, with connotations of regret rather than forgotten, but that through public demonstrations of guilt today, room is made for reconciliation. As an article in Psychology Today put it, apology is not just a social nicety. It is an important ritual, a way of showing respect and empathy for the wronged person. For those affected in the past, receiving a public apology can lead to healing and moving past anger, no longer perceiving the wrongdoer as a threat. One can only imagine the good, the possible good, that this could do for society. If a government meaningfully apologized for its failures, could it lessen or stop wars? Could communities feel more accepted? Could it better world relations? Only possibilities, but perhaps ones worth thinking about. Moving on to my second point. We learn from it. I came across the following comment posted online while researching this talk. Why judge the past when it seems to continually elicit a deep disappointment in our ancestors? They will never live up to our present-day standards. This is not the point of presentism. When I judge my past self, as we all naturally do, I am disappointed by my actions in times of stress, arrogance, and ignorance. I have pushed people away and manipulated others closer, a classic example of a flawed human. It pains me and I cringe to remember, so why do I put myself through these reflections? Because it's not all I get. I endeavor to learn from that mistake. I hope to recognize when I am on the brink of doing it again and consider my next move more deeply. It makes a difference. And arguably, this is why presentism is important. Humanity's present situation can be summed up quite nicely by a quote from Margaret Macmillan. We can learn from history, but we can also deceive ourselves when we selectively take evidence from the past to justify what we have already made our minds up to do. There are a great number of examples where we haven't heeded the advice from the past, but there are also examples in which we have, and benefits have been reaped. Woodrow Wilson's 14-point program for world peace, following World War I, was designed to learn from the past and stop another war from taking place. We do not know how effective it would have been if it was implemented, but we do know that the harsh sanctions on Germany, which the program did not support, facilitated Hitler rising to power and the coming on of the Second World War. learning from the failures of its predecessor, the League of Nations, the United Nations remains a prosperous institution to this day. The introduction of their own army, which the League of Nations did not have, allowed them to take robust action against aggressors, an example of this being in the Korean War. With regards to learning from the past and where I think humanity could be, I turn to Edmund Burke, who said, "In history, a great volume is unrolled for our instruction, drawing the materials of future wisdom from the past errors and infirmities of mankind." We inevitably look to the past for an understanding of where we are today and for guidelines for the future, and while doing so, we are bound to use a moral prism. It is in our nature. We can even just take a look at GCSE history questions, one being, to what extent was the Treaty of Versailles fair? Presentism is unavoidable. In the academic community, advocating the importance of this practice is bound to elicit some sneers. But its worth is not found in the analytical essays that judge to judge alone. Rather, it is the consequences of using presentism, striving for a politically correct stance, that matters. An essay on how it was wrong for Cortés, Spanish conquistador, to invade Mexico, killing countless natives in the process and ultimately leading to the genocide of the Native Americans, it's not going to make much of a difference because we can't do much about it. It's in the past, yes. But the lessons learned and what we do with this information can make significant differences. As Donald Trump, President of the United States of America, attempts to place a wall around the border of Mexico to stop people in need from coming in because they are not Americans, he not only forgets the principles on which America was built, all men are created equal, but most of all, he forgets that Americans themselves were immigrants. By not apologizing for the persecution of, say, the LGBTQ+ community, how are they expected to feel accepted in the present? Without a public apology, what are we teaching the children of this generation? We may not be to blame for what happened, but we are responsible for what happens next. Fricker also convincingly argues, people who have been wronged by the state deserve an apology by the state, even if the individuals in government are different from those at the time. And so, look at your moral compass. Speak out against the past and learn. Use presentism to teach others through your learning, through your example. Ultimately, judging the past is important to better the present. And who doesn't want that? Thank you.